I'm not a guy who necessarily feels the fighters are entitled to 50% of the UFC's profits, but I am enormously in favor of the fighters having some platform for collective bargaining, and the MMA Athletes Association represents a pretty significant step in that direction. The problem with these unions is that they're almost always represented by a businessman, a lawyer, or some other shady fucking shyster who we all instantly distrust. If you've looked into the recent launch of the association, you'll have noticed that the most talked about aspect of the whole fucking thing isn't their objectives or fighter grievances. It's mostly been backlash aimed at the involvement of former Bellator president Bjorn Rebney. Dana has called Bjorn a scumbag and a piece of shit, who just wants to slide his hand into the fighters' pockets. To be honest, if these comments were taken out of context, I wouldn't know if Dana was aiming them at Bjorn or if he was standing in front of a fucking mirror. But regardless of the obvious hypocrisy, Dana did perfectly summarize the general consensus on Bjorn's involvement. So I just want to try to answer the questions: why does everybody hate Bjorn Rebney, and what are the implications of his involvement in the association? One of the more sordid stories fueling the Bjorn hate is that he murdered Sugar Ray Leonard's dog. It's difficult to get a fleshed-out version of events on this. The only decent article I can find on the subject reads like the screenplay for LA Confidential. It involves the FBI, private investigators, a detective who was later indicted for wiretapping, a high-profile love affair, and a dead dog found with a metal spike driven through its fucking skull. It's so convoluted and far-fetched, I had to check twice to make sure the story wasn't written by Guy Ritchie. Anyway, it turns out it wasn't Sugar Ray's dog. It actually belonged to Rebney's former business partner, Seth Ursoff. And there really appears to be nothing linking Bjorn to the dog's death, outside of the suspicious timing of the crime. The dog's body was found one day after Seth filed a lawsuit against Bjorn. So really, it's just an accusation. The only reason I'm bringing it up is because people have been sharing that story like it's a fact. Like they heard it from their cousin who actually saw Bjorn luring the dog into the back of a van with a string of fucking sausages. In the spirit of fairness, I'm gonna give Bjorn the benefit of the doubt here, just based on the lack of information and the fact that the accusation came from someone who was already at Bjorn's throat to the point of litigation. You gotta take that story with a grain of salt. The main reason people dislike Bjorn boils down to the perception of him as a ruthless, predacious former president of Bellator. The most publicized and drawn-out controversy revolved around Eddie Alvarez's attempt to leave Bellator for the UFC. Bellator had a stipulation that allowed them to match any offer made by other promotions. The UFC made an offer which included an immediate title shot against Ben Henderson and a generous pay-per-view cut. In reality, this was an offer Bellator simply could not match, because they didn't have a pay-per-view model. But in a disingenuous attempt to do so, Bjorn took the UFC's contract and simply crossed out the word Zuffa and replaced it with the word Bellator, which was a perfect match in the most literal copy and pasting sense. But in reality, there was a potential $1 million gulf between the offers. The shadiest part of the whole thing was that Eddie was able to release two versions of a contract describing the terms of the matching process. One, which was sent to Eddie's management, stipulated that Bellator had the right to match the terms of Zuffa's offer. The other contract, which was sent directly to Eddie, stated that Bellator had the right to match the material terms of Zuffa's offer. Now, it seems like a minor detail, but the advantage of the phrase material terms over simply the terms was that the language of the former is slightly more ambiguous and therefore open to a broader legal interpretation, which may have provided Bellator with an avenue to legally qualify Bjorn's copy and pasting as a legitimate match of Zuffa's contract, which of course is fucking ridiculous. The net result of the whole thing was that Eddie Alvarez was sidelined for over a year, and watching his prime slipping away in the courtroom, he eventually got tired of waiting around and settled with Bellator, in an agreement which potentially cost him millions of dollars and the opportunity to compete with the best in the world. In a nutshell, Eddie got fucked and there did appear to be a lot of shadiness on Bjorn's behalf. In 2012, Jonathan Brookins revealed that he too had become tangled up in litigation with Bellator. Following his loss to Jose Aldo, Brookins was released from the WEC. He was then offered a fight with Bellator on the understanding that if he won, he'd be entered into their featherweight tournament. He won the fight by first-round stoppage, but according to Brookins, they refused to put him in the tournament because if he won, it would look like their champion was a WEC reject. So they shelved his ass and said they didn't want anything more to do with him. Brookins went on to win a few fights in a smaller organization before winning Season 12 of The Ultimate Fighter. Now, Bjorn didn't give a flying fuck about Jonathan while he was off fighting in G-Force. But as soon as he appeared on the big show, Bjorn was suddenly going through his contract with a fine-tooth comb, and over 3 years after his only fight in Bellator, Brookins was still battling the motherfuckers in court. There's a lot of similar stories. Bjorn repeatedly trashed Ben Askren's style in the media. And when his contract ended, Bjorn didn't make Ben an acceptable offer, essentially releasing a 4-time defending champion for being too boring. Now, although I agree with that characterization of Askren's style, his release was a serious slap in the face for us fools who still think that MMA is a fucking sport. So anyway, the perception of Bjorn was that he was absolutely ruthless in terms of contracts and litigation. If you sign a contract with Bjorn, there's a very good chance that contract will come back to bite you in the fucking ass. And as the Alvarez debacle showed, he's not afraid to fight dirty and be downright underhanded in his methods. On the flip side, Bjorn did do a phenomenal job with Bellator. He built the organization from the ground up. He used an exciting tournament format to create a fresh alternative to the UFC. And by the time he was replaced by Scott Coker, Bellator was unquestionably the number 2 promotion in MMA. So although he's clearly sneaky as fuck, I don't judge the guy for fighting tooth and nail, because by doing that, he prevented Bellator from ever being perceived as a training camp for the UFC. It was always perceived as a unique and exciting alternative. Bellator had its own thing going right from the start. And now that Viacom are involved, you can bet your balls the fighters are more than happy that there's a legit competitor with deep pockets for them to test free agency and find their true market value. Say what you want about the guy, but that's the other side of Bjorn's legacy. So outside of his dirty tactics, I don't really blame Bjorn for the lawsuits, the injunctions, etc. The problem for me is that because Bjorn is now in a position where he's basically a champion of fighter rights, that's a position that has an inherent moral high ground. Bjorn is using that moral high ground to frame himself as the fucking patron saint of MMA. When Ariel Helwani asked him why he's involved in the association, he took us on a heartbreaking trip down memory lane, where he recounted stories from his youth of watching fighters retire completely destitute and battling injuries. He then went on to state that he simply can't stand bullies like the UFC. I was listening thinking, yeah, Bjorn, sounds good, but where the fuck were these ideals when you had Eddie Alvarez sitting on the sidelines for over a year while a bunch of greasy fucking lawyers went sifting through reams of convoluted legalese bullshit trying to interpret the nuances of nonsense like material terms? How did you feel about bullies then? Bjorn is a guy who, time and time again, we've seen putting dollars in business above what's best for the fighters. Now, he was the president of Bellator, so I don't necessarily disagree with that. But it makes his claims of being some type of noble moral crusader who only cares about the welfare of fighters seem incredibly disingenuous. Behind Bjorn's maneuvering is almost certainly a selfish desire to re-establish himself as one of the preeminent figures in MMA. Having said that, that doesn't really bother me. With regards to fighter benefits, we don't really have the luxury of being overly idealistic. From a practical standpoint, if Bjorn is the most capable individual of successfully getting this thing off the ground, I don't care what his motives are. And outside of murdering more puppies, I don't give a shit about how he gets it done either. If he can bring about fighter pensions or more comprehensive health insurance, then I'm on board, 100%. so let's just see what he can actually do. Unfortunately, his presence seems to be a possible deterrent in fighters joining the association, and his first impression has been less than stellar. He came out on the offensive, assumed the moral high ground, and tried to provoke the UFC by throwing insults and purposely disseminating misleading financial figures. As we know, it doesn't take much to provoke Dana, and he's responded in typically childish fashion, calling Bjorn a piece of shit and a scumbag. The group's launch has devolved into a shit-slinging contest between two grown fucking babies, and that's just not a good look for an association that wants to be taken seriously. I mean, you could easily be forgiven for forgetting that it's not actually about either of these guys. It's the Athletes Association.